So we're going to take about probably 20 minutes to have a solution set, so to speak. And I'm going to pose a question to the panel, but I want to immediately open this also up to the room to ask questions and comments. So thank you all for your presentations today. So here's the question I'd like to pose. With climate change, and I'm thinking globally right here and then zeroing in on local, with climate change, the growing world population and demands for industrialization putting strains on global and local water supplies, how do you see the agriculture and especially how do you see agriculture and especially family farmers adapting in order to contribute to food security and nutrition for our growing population? And I think the mic there is going to pick up your answers. So does anybody want to start or respond to that?
I defer to Jacob.
Anyone else want to go first? I can collect my thoughts.
You can collect your thoughts. I can tell you what I think is very likely already in play. We've been working with the major food supply chain industries, from Cargill to McDonald's to Walmart to everybody, and in conversations with them, and they are scared now. They are extremely nervous about food supply, food chains. Boy, was that alcoholic? I thought it was just bubbly. There is a major movement afoot within the food supply chains to secure supplies. And it is completely changing the way a lot of the big industrial operators are and have been thinking. So, for example, McDonald's just stepped forward and said, we want to know about this ant grazing and know how this might be able to help create a more durable food supply chain for our beef. Our market is changing. In Canada, they can no longer serve beef that's not grass-fed, grass-finished. It's changing very rapidly, and they don't know what to do about this. You know, grass-fed, grass-finished, my understanding, about a 38 to 40% per annum growth rate, and there's not a supply of adequate reliability in the U.S. To meet that need. So there's big shifts in the market right now. So I think it's going to come back to stable, localized supplies of food. And I think a lot of these big operations are going to adjust in the way they procure and the way they identify what a suitable supply is. I think, we're starting to see milk supplies right now. The market is really changing with regard to milk purchasing. Big changes are about to occur. Supplies and demands and the market and the consumer interests are really starting to shape the future of the food supply systems. So it's happening in different parts of the country at different rates.
You're saying this is being driven by the consumers? Is that what you're saying?
Well, partly, I think there's a number of things. I think water, access to reliable water, is just changing the name of the game for the big dairies in the central part of the country and Central Valley of California. Big changes in water availability. In other parts of the world, water availability and equal access to water rather than purchased. How do you say it? The wealthy have, preferred access. It's not the case in most countries. It's the case here where the purchasing power, kind of like voting power, dictates access. But in a lot of the world, that's not what's happening.
But my question is, for example, on the grass-fed, grass-finished beef, is that being driven by the desire of the consumer to have a safer food supply, or what?
I think that's what my colleagues that are studying the marketplace would say. That interest in human health, nutrition, cancer, and cancer therapy, and foundational human health is driving a lot of it. And even if that's not fundamentally driving the change, it's a belief system that's changing.
Which will drive it, because
Right.
it is the perception.
That's right.
Now, Steve, when you mentioned in Canada they can't sell it, is that because of government regulations
No.
or consumers?
Consumer driven.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what's the A&W? A&W restaurant started a.
Parties, I think.
It was A&W. It's called the root beer burger
Oh, okay.
because it was A&W in Canada, in Alberta, that started doing only grass-fed, grass-finished burgers. And they called it. I've never eaten one, but they called it the root beer burger because it was A&W, and A&W was known for root beer. They started this thing, and then all of a sudden, McDonald's was forced to follow suit, and Hardee's and all the other.
Carl Jr.'s, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Whenever we're up here.
So big shifts that are occurring, and whether it's durable or not, to be learned about.
I've heard CAFOs described as a not sustainable model for food production, whatever it is, milk or whatever. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure I'm the person to ask that question because I don't know enough about CAFOs per se, but we have had conversations with the largest vegetable producers and largest meat producing operations, Cargill, OSI. They're moving toward different models is the easy answer, and I don't know the details of a lot of that. I know some of the large leafy green producers in California, David Perry Farms, one of the biggest. They're moving toward localized, they're not small farms, they're 5,000 acre farms. They're moving toward ultra water conservation techniques for irrigation, not drip irrigation and not overhead irrigation. They're rebuilding soil organic carbon as a way to hold moisture in the water, in the soil. So, these are little stars that are glimmering. How it all comes together, I don't know, but hopefully you've gathered your thoughts by now.
Yeah. Well, now it's a lot more thoughts, but
Oh, no.
with the CAFO answer, if it's sustainable or not, I would really say that it's not sustainable. And I don't want that to be like a gotcha or something like that. But if you think about it from a lot of different angles, sustainable, how long of a time frame we're talking about? Are we talking about sustainable, again, human lifetime of 50 years, or are we thinking hundreds or longer? Or is it, a lot of CAFO owners are probably going to be thinking about 20, 30 years. I think one of the things that's unsustainable about it is the consumer demand for it. We're living in a much more integrated technological world where consumers are having that type of relationship with their food. And so I question the sustainability of having CAFOs being able to drive and keep their business model because of the customer. But also if you think about how energy dependent, when you do localize that much, it's the exact opposite of what we're talking about, where the animals are doing as much of the work, and it's trying to be as energy, reduce energy as much as possible. They're doing the opposite. And we're already having a lot of big issues with carbon in the atmosphere and energy usage. In the time being, I think they get away with it, but in the long term, I think those issues really start biting the butt, and it's all about how long we're thinking.
I'd love to jump in here. I am typically the sunniest person in the room
Oh, no.
in terms of Pollyanna-ish beliefs. But I will say, as someone who's really active in a farm organization and who interacts with a lot of other farm organizations, the consumer demand for sustainably grown and more humane and more climate carbon friendly food has people scared, and they're the I don't want to use the term big ag, but the institutionalized ag, the way it's gone, is in fear of its very life, its very existence. And where we have seen the demand for this food go up, I am seeing already in the ag world a pushback against that messaging that is going to be so fierce and so overwhelming. You'll be seeing it in ads. You'll start to question whether organics are better, whether we have climate change, right? Whether it's trees or potatoes taking the water. Those things are being called into question, and in a really savvy form, because it's millions of dollars going toward this campaign. And I'm really not a doomsday person by nature, but I feel a sense of doom about the pushback to the increase in consumer demand. There's a term called sustainable intensification that's really hot right now in agriculture, and the idea is that in order for us to survive, like if you buy that there's climate change, in order for us to survive it as farmers, we will need to become so smart and so savvy and have such big precision equipment that is giant tractors that someone like me who didn't go to school for sustainable intensification can possibly understand or know how to operate. So that the idea is that production will be taken out of the hands of the small, knees on the dirt, hose, hand farming people, moving our gates and our wires every day, and it's going to be put in the hands of only the people who can understand that equipment. Like Steve described, the extremely targeted irrigation. And while there's benefit to that, you need to understand that what's underneath it is that farming will no longer be for everybody. It will be for the experts. Currently the experts, in the form of 4 companies, getting fewer all the time, are growing all of our seed, providing all of our fertilizer. And now on the other side, there's about 4 big people buying all of the grain, all of the milk, all of the hogs, all of the steers. So our food system is in the control of a very few ginormous players, and they are scared.
And very vulnerable for that reason.
Extremely vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and they know it. They're on the run. And they're not going to go down without a fight.
So we've just been working with the largest pork producer on the planet and looking at what was the state-of-the-art pork production enterprise for the past 50 years, 40 years. And every one of their operations is under consent decree now for multiple violations. And they've got $600 billion in liability. And they lost their ass on pork last year. They did not break a profit, not because of the liability. They made their money on chicken last year. So, and Cargill, the big one of the, they lost their ass on beef last year and made their money on chicken and pork. So there's a really big shakeup occurring right now. I don't know how far it'll go. I don't know if there is such a thing as stabilization.
Well, the consumer's gonna have to take responsibility for this. We're gonna have to be really tough consumers.
We've got some questions here, 3 of them over in that part. Why don't you start with Dick and then to Pat?
Well, I have kind of a comment, actually. My wife and I, we were traveling in California, and we happened to drive the length of the Central Valley, which is an unbelievable ag area. And I was in the Central Valley, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, and I talked to a couple of people there too. And it's amazing what they're growing now. It's mostly trees, and it's mostly vines. They're not plowing much soil. And there was one absolutely huge CAFO. I don't know how big it was. It was unbelievably big, though.
Those are not happy cows.
But they're not happy cows, and I think there's enough there. There's all the byproducts from all these fruit trees that they can feed these animals. So you're going to have some CAFOs there because the food's so cheap. But of course, water. We went by endless numbers of signs about the politics of water.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fascinating too. So I just felt good though about the idea that they don't have to plow the soil so much. They've got just grass growing under these trees and vines.
Well, that used to be one of the most productive wetland systems and bunch grassland systems on the planet that supported huge flocks of waterfowl.
Right.
And it's down to 1/10 of 1% what remains. And we've been working with the Harris Ranch in Stockton, which is the big CAFO that you may have driven by. It's one of the largest CAFOs in the country for beef. And they're under water duress. They don't have land for respreading manure. They're under court order because of ammonia emissions, atmospheric emissions. They used to supply manure to the almond producers and others, and now 200,000-300,000 acres of almonds have been taken out of production, just plucked the trees because they didn't have ample water to grow the almonds. So there's big changes in that food basket that are underway.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because we saw lots of young plantings. Maybe not almonds, but you've got all the citrus, you've got all the other nut trees, you've got olives, and all over the place.
Some areas have gotten new allocations, and we'll see what happens with the high water volume they've got this year. People seem to forget. So we'll see what happens.
It's as if they never really understood anyway. I lived in Bakersfield for a year back in around 2001, and I was just stunned. I would watch the Happy Cow commercials and just go. Because the CAFO 5 miles down the road, those poor cows were out in full sun when it was 110 degrees out, and they only got under shelter when they were milked. It was just the most ghastly thing, and the almond trees were beautiful until they picked the almonds, and you could tell which field was being done because there was this massive cloud of dirt, and I was never had so many respiratory problems as I had living in Bakersfield. And I have severe allergies here, but I was sicker there.
Pretty stinky place.
Yeah, and then you wander over and see the oil fields, and that's a whole nother ballgame.
Well, what amazed me is my last trip there is we flew in a small plane from Stockton all the way up to Northern California and then up into Oregon. And at 8,000 feet, 9,000 feet above the ground, we could smell when we were going over every CAFO.
Really?
Yeah, the thermal, it's a closed basin, and the convective activity is vertical. Sucks in from the foothills and goes vertical above the basin floor. And we could smell, and there'd be a bump when you go fly above every bare field. The plane would be jarred. So.
Well, the good news is that there are people like Jacob who want to farm, who are young and want to come back to the land. And if you have land available, let me know, because I'll find a farmer to farm for you.
I was just telling Ruth that there's a lot of people are talking in the sustainable ag world that the next 20 years, roughly like 400 million acres of farmland, which is, to put that into context, is the size of Louisiana Purchase, is meant to change hands in the next 2 decades. And based on our economic situation and our educational system, I don't know if the next generation is going to be in position or want to take over that land. So we need to think about that. You're talking about the PR push.
Yeah.
There is a huge PR push, and they are targeting that next generation for sure.
With precision ag.
Yeah, and talking. I went down to the National FFA convention with the Greenhorns, which is a young farming coalition that's on the federal level. And they brought me down there to vend at the National FFA convention 2 years ago. And kids would sometimes come up to us and be like, how can you advocate for organic food and sustainable food? It's not sustainable, and really attacking us. And there's just a lot of money there. And they're hosting seminars, and they are recruiting, they call them ag advocates.
Yep.
And it's definitely one-dimensional. And I came up through FFA too, and I was telling that I used to give speeches on a completely different way of agriculture just 8 years ago. But it's getting ramped up.
Pat and then Barbara had a question too. Well, I just wanted to piggyback on what you're saying about sustainable ag and the pushback, and that is that whenever you're in a doctor's office, a bank lobby, or whenever you go to the a store or an implement dealer, if any of you do, or a feed mill, look around at the magazines that are sitting there. Try to ask a neighbor to see their magazine of successful farming, Ag Review, Wisconsin Farmer, Country Today even. Any of the magazines, Jacob, you probably know more of them, and just flip through it and read the ads. Horrid's Dairyman, I picked one of those up at the doctor's office the other day. And see, get yourself into the head of what Big Ag is telling you.
Telling farmers.
Telling farmers. Telling farmers to tell you. And I agree with you that there's a pushback. But realize also that every time you walk in the store, when you go into Piggly Wiggly and you see that they only sell Smithfield pork, what is that?
It's really salty.
It's one of those 4 biggest pork processors in the world.
Owned by China.
Owned by China.
Smithfield pork is
Yeah.
Chinese.
So, every purchase we make, it really is a vote on which way we're going to go. We only spend about 12 to 15% of our disposable income on food in America. And they are ruthless about saying, well, don't you want cheap food? And as long as we keep saying, yes, that's exactly what we want is cheap food, then that just feeds the machine. So we really do need to take a stand on it. One other thing on that, and what you both said, is that there is a movement afoot to transfer the idea of a watershed into a food shed, right here, right in Broadhead, and using the Sugar River watershed and the Peck watershed as the basis for a food shed, where we produce our own food to serve our own communities. And of course, that depends on our communities supporting us to grow your food. So that movement is afoot. Talk to any of we 3. We'll get you in touch with whoever it is that wants to be involved in that in the future. This is only in the planning stages, but we're excited about it. And I think that would be sustainable. We got to get over that notion that we have to get big or get out, and that we have to feed the world. Those are the first 2. Whenever you hear those phrases, get a red flag up and like Jacob, start analyzing it and thinking about it.
Thanks, Pat. Barbara, did you still have a question?
Well, I just wanted to. Oh gosh, okay. Well, I mean, it's a very complex subject, and we all know how complex it is, and international trade and all kinds of issues. One thing I think, there are 2 things I think that really militate against these confined farming operations that we all despise, and that is that the indiscriminate use of antibiotics, which takes place, and that is like really critical. And it's been talked about for decades, and eventually something may happen, but it is a very real factor, and it's becoming more important. And that is one thing I would throw back in anybody's face who talks about a more efficient way to do it, because more efficient means crowded and more prone to disease. And the other thing is the public is way more sensitive to animal cruelty than they would be to whether it's healthier for me to eat this tangerine or eat the cookie. I mean, I picked the cookie first and then I ate the tangerine, but the public is not as concerned about their own nutrition and their own well-being. But when we see these horrific pictures of gestation cages for pigs, and the way our poultry is raised today, the way eggs are produced today, that is really going to support you guys more than perhaps you may feel. I mean, you're sensitive to the pushback.
I'm just saying it's ag right now.
Well, sure, and there is pushback, and they've got a lot of power, but the American public is very sensitive, and you see petitions all the time, get Subway off at the college campuses. There was a big food company that provided supplied services to university cafeterias, and there was a big push, and they come up begrudgingly with minor changes over the years, but they're being forced to do things differently, which will help. So those are 2 factors that I think are really, really important.
A couple of weeks ago in Canada, we spent a day with a medical team and I didn't know this, but I mean, I had a sense from what I've read that this was real, but autoimmune diseases and all sorts of diseases that typically hit 50 and older aged Americans and Canadians are now becoming real prevalent in 30-year-old Americans and Canadians and 40-year-old Americans and Canadians. And some of the really serious autoimmune diseases are becoming very prevalent. You know, real skew in the age. The nurses can probably tell us more about that. But the doctors at this meeting in Toronto are saying that it comes down to it's absolutely all about diet.
Yeah.
And there was a 3-hour presentation on omega-3 fatty acid profiles in milk and another in meat products. And one of the doctors followed, his wife was pregnant and she'd given birth, and followed her diet and followed fatty acid profile through her own breast milk, and was able to show her increased risk of some of the autoimmune diseases based on the fatty acid profiles in his own family.
Yeah.
And then when they decided to become rigorous about what they ate, he said you can't take supplements to create the changes. Mm-hmm. It comes down to whole, fresh, nutritious food. Yeah. It's the only thing he's aware of that does it.
But as we were talking this morning, you and I, people can be told and they can know fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, meats in moderation. Nothing wrong with meat, everything, it's in moderation. But the sad part is, even in this country, so few people can really afford a diet like that because of government programs that subsidize the things that get turned into the high calorie, low nutrition snacks.
They live in a food desert.
Yeah, or they live in a food desert. Even if they had the money, it's not available. But
well, what I got out of that presentation was we can't fool the biology of the human species. That it really does come down to quality food and nutritious food and wholesome diets, and you can't supplement it, you can't augment it.
Right, yeah.
That when we try to do that, like he found out with his own wife, and then with data mining in EPIC and other medical databases, the fatty acid profiles aren't there, and the autoimmune disease frequencies are intensifying. So I see this converging line from human health being perhaps pretty darn influential in decision making.
And not to go so far afield, but this is an issue that's important. It's important to all of us. Developing countries, China, Mexico, other countries are seeing the kind of health problems as their diet got to be like ours. They're seeing the same kind of health issues. So I think there's plenty to hope for in what you guys are doing. I really do, despite the big money.
I'm just saying, just watch for it.
I know what you're saying, but there's other people who are looking at the other side of it too.
There's a hand back there, I think.
And Meg, so once we have these two folks comment, we're going to have to wrap up here pretty quick. It's almost 3:30.
I think, if we could snap our fingers and create a sustainable food source for the world, and we could do it today, could we feed the masses? We're all here, we're kind of preaching to the choir, but there are some issues there too. And it's going to take a while to evolve. If you're going to change culture, it's going to take a while to do it.
Well, we waste 40% of our food here in America. So
right,
the issue
right.
isn't that we can't, that we need, the world would prefer to feed itself. And there's removing barriers to letting that happen. Most of the world's food is grown by women, smallholders, using hand tools on less than 5 acres. And we should be supporting them in their desire to do that and grow their own things instead of imposing equipment, seeds, and unknown chemicals into their cultures. So, sorry.
My grandma fed.
Yeah.
My
I don't know.
grandma fed
Can we
7
feed
of
the
us,
masses?
so-
We don't have to,
We don't have to. We could stop tomorrow and the masses
and
will
let
be
them feed
fed.
themselves.
Okay. Well, I don't know.
I question the use of the word sustainable.
Yeah.
We don't want to sustain what we have. To go back to your parsing language, regenerative or some other term would be more appropriate. And then I think we have to decide what we want to produce and for whom, and not be blown around by, propaganda and mythology.
Thank you.
And I'd like to remind us, especially those of you who are close to my age, that when I was growing up, a cigarette was considered a entertainment,
Right.
a perfectly safe, heavily advertised, and a big part of our economy were the tobacco companies. And that changed 100%. And it changed despite heavy advertising by tobacco. And it changed because people were afraid of the health consequences, or realized they had to be afraid of the health consequences of tobacco. It changed. I mean, this is a different world than when I was growing up. There's no reason why this can't happen with food.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so to follow up on what Meg just said, Steve and I both attended a conference last week that focused on the emerging contaminants in groundwater, and there were some big messages that came out of that conference from the 60 scientists or so that were present there and spoke. And one of them was, and this actually was on the policy end of it, and that is that the idea of safe, clean water is going to be the biggest political issue going forward than just about anything else, because of what people are experiencing in Flint, in Toronto, other parts of the world,
Kewanee.
Des Moines, Iowa, Kewanee,
Detroit, Chicago.
and thousands of chemicals being detected in our groundwater and our water supplies that are being contaminated by our own sewage systems that are, both of those infrastructures are breaking down. And what's in our sewage system is showing up in our well water and our municipal water. We're essentially drinking each other's drugs. They're detecting components of diabetes 2 medications that are really skyrocketing because we have these health issues and we're being prescribed these medications that everybody is supposed to take, and they're designed to have some percentage of it doesn't get utilized by the body and we excrete it, and that's now what we're drinking.
I love the birth control effects of it. And the artificial sweetener that comes with every glass of fresh water. It's so good for you.
Yeah.
Now neonicotinoids are in all water supplies.
Yes,
And like
exactly. That was
bees-
on the list.
Bees love that stuff,
They
but they're
love
not
it.
around to tell the story.
And you're saying those drugs are not treated in sewage treatment plants?
No.
They're not being treated yet because our science is getting so good. We're detecting these compounds at parts per billion, but we don't know how to study. We can't study them fast enough to put regulations on them, and that takes a lot of time. So we were told by some that we might be hearing more health alerts, coming out from the scientific community saying, we can't regulate this, but you should know that this might be in your water, and you should be cautious about it.
Yeah, I mean, even your own septic system. So,
Yeah.
if you have a well and you have a septic system, I mean, the fragrances in our perfumed, what do you call it, stuff you wash your hair with, there are all sorts of chemicals. It's 40,000 to 60,000 new chemical constituents that we know nothing about, that have not been characterized. We don't know the human health impacts. We don't know the health on, the impacts on our livestock, and they've been approved in products or, just de facto have been used in products. So very frightening.
And we're very regulation averse at the moment.
Yes.
Well, even during a period where we had a big push and we were spending hundreds of billions of dollars to understand this stuff, it is impossible to understand this stuff and do it in a defensible way that would be defensible in a court of law. So we're fooling ourselves into thinking regulations are going to provide the safety net for a lot of these common chemicals. and new constituents that are added. One of the stories Jim Ludwig sent me was how the chemical industry has intentionally stayed about a decade ahead on atrazine is banned, so they changed the chemical nature by moving one methoxy group and put it in another location, and it's called another chemical, and nobody knows its effects, and they introduce it, and then 5 years later that gets banned, and they move the hydroxy group to another carbon molecule, and they call it something different, and that's approved because there's no argument against it. Well, it's not. There's nothing to. Nothing.
Yeah.
There's no regulations.
Right.
That chemical's not even recognized.
Right.
So it just goes through the process until somebody can evaluate it, which is always a decade behind. So the regulations are not going to help. So we talked about we need a completely different way of thinking about how to understand contaminant effects and how to approve or disapprove or screen. Because the process we have, it's 3 cups in a ball, and
Right.
they keep adding more cups and more balls, and
Yeah, like endless duo, just keep changing a little bit on the 2,4-D and a little bit of the glyphosate. Now we got something new.
So one more comment or question, and then we have to
And I'll
wrap
shut
up.
Oh, I think you had a question back there. Were you good?
Oh, Steve kind of stole my comment.
Oh.
It seems like messaging is utmost in this modern world of ours, and I think, like Jacob, you probably understand that now as you're developing your marketing business, that the message is of utmost importance. And I think this kind of goes also to what Chris was saying. I think what you're saying is that the term sustainable is being co-opted in a big way by people who most people in this room would not consider to be sustainable. So I guess I would suggest you use the term.
That I'm able to stay in business.
Well, just to frame the subject in their terms, the term sustainable, and I've heard it 6-7 times here in the last half hour to 45 minutes, and that kind of disappointed me, which is why I was glad, Steve, that you brought up the term regenerative, and it's part of.
I wanted to beat Marty to the punch. I knew you were thinking of it.
And I know that you have regeneration in your messaging for your website and for your farm. This group is not looking to sustain things as they are in this watershed, and you know it. You're trying to regenerate. So as you go forward, I think that you have to think in terms of regeneration, and as you speak to people, you talk in terms of regeneration, not only of water quality, but of community and everything else you've been talking about today.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. This has been a great conversation.
Susie, I think Ed had a comment.
Ed.
I got one comment. I work as a nutritionist. Zinc, manganese, selenium, iodine are all short in this area. Yeah. Now, we don't put that on our crops, it's not going to be in your food. So you people got to learn how to balance your diet. If you have any questions, buy the nutritional almanac or look it up on the computer or ask.
Wow, thanks. Okay, well, I think we should probably turn this over now to the raffle people and the gambling part of the day. And Lindsay's going to draw and announce the winner.